Sorry to take so long getting this done. It's the first time I've tried to do these video summations, and there's a severe amount of work doing it. What I really wanted to do was just try and pick up a few points that were in the various discussions and give you a little bit of a take on them and hopefully point you in a few directions you might not have thought to go. But I certainly have to say I'm impressed by the diversity and quality of your discussion comments. Um, One of the things that obviously is central to the course is trying to figure out the differences and the interactions between bioregions and food sheds. I mean, if we're not familiar with either of those terms in the first place, it can be a little bit daunting to get started with. The bioregion, we've talked about, and Thayer and these other people have discussed in some detail that there is no one definition for this, and that we're looking at a number of definitions that have been used over time for what constitutes a unit of planning. And I myself, I took the bioregional theory course in the Msfs course, and since I live at the very tip of West Virginia, at the confluence of the Shenandoah and Potomac rivers, I look one way out of my house and I'm looking at Maryland. I look the other way out of the house, I'm looking at Virginia. I'm in West Virginia. I have so little to do with the rest of West Virginia that the political thing is pretty obvious to me. But I have to think, what do the watersheds of the Potomac and Shenandoah River have to do with my area? And one of the most important things that I think, and I saw some discussion of this, especially in reference to the Rockies and the plains and places like that. When you're thinking about the bioregion, yes, it can be the plants, the animals, the climate, the weather, the soils, all of that. But when you're thinking about the food shed, you're sort of coming at it from a different direction, and you're not asking yourself how um, small or large should I define this region based on its characteristics, but how small or large should I base this region in terms of can it provide for a complete human diet for the population that's there? And that's a slightly different way of looking at things. In our case, you could say that everything west of the Blue Ridge and south of the Catoctons, these are two mountain ranges near here, that encompass the Potomac and the Shenandoah before they break through the Blue Ridge into the Piedmont at Harper's Ferry, the town I live in. But really, when you think about the food supply of the Mid-Atlantic, you're crazy not to include the Chesapeake Bay because of the access to the ocean and seafood and shellfish and all of these kinds of things. That's only 50 miles away. It's not really what I consider part of my bioregion because, as some of the other Mid-Atlantic people have noticed, there is a three-part break in the Atlantic coast down in this area. You have the Tidewater, and then you have the Piedmont. The Piedmont is everything that is above what is called the fall line, which is the top of the tidal surge from the Atlantic. At the end of navigable waterways, all of these kinds of things, and a pretty big difference in the soils as well. Then you have a third uh, layer for us, which is basically constituted the Blue Ridge, which runs parallel to the coast about another 30, 40 miles at our area in from the fall line. And so you have the Tidewater, the Piedmont, and in our case, you have the Shenandoah Valley. This valley, as it turns out, actually runs all the way from down around Atlanta up to almost Montreal. And I think that some of you all who are in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont and parts of New England that are inland will find that looking at what's known as the Great Valley of the East will be useful for you because it will show you some of the sort of underlying geological, morphological characteristics that are on a very large scale in the east. In my case, I chose really only about 50 miles at the northern end of the Shenandoah Valley as my particular bioregion. But as my food shed, I'm inclined to go over the Blue Ridge into the Piedmont and the Tidewater and include at least part of the Chesapeake Bay so that we have a broad range of food in our food shed. Another thing that affects this is questions, particularly, I believe, Victoria from Telluride And then I'm sorry, I forget who was just down out of the Rockies into the plains, right at the edge of the Rockies, and you ask yourself, well, based on my bioregion, which is high mountains, I shouldn't be including the plains, and yet we have our colleague who drives out into the plains to their CSA to get the kinds of foods that aren't easily produced in the Rockies, especially given the seasonal constraints in Telluride, which are not unlike the seasonal constraints in the coldest parts of Vermont. You want to say to yourself, shouldn't I include, say, 30 or 40 miles of the westernmost plains in front of the Front Range as part of my food shed, even if not as part of my bioregion? Questions like that. And someone did say, well, what do the Aboriginal people do? Well, the town that I'm from in Vermont, where I was born, is at the headwaters of the West River, all the way up at the headwaters of the West River. And in fact, it's at a spot where within about a mile, you can be in the West River, which is the Connecticut River watershed. You can be in the Hudson River watershed, or you can be in the St. Lawrence River watershed, all in a very, very small area. It's a very high alpine region. It's a ski town like Telluride. And the question of Aboriginal survival there is something that you find out is um, a moot point, essentially, because they didn't live there. They were smart enough to live down out of the mountains in the lower elevations where the winters were considerably less severe. And they basically went up in the mountains to hunt. Uh, Even in nomadic cultures in other parts of the world, you'll find that the higher alpine valleys were not necessarily where people lived, but where they took their livestock for the summer. So keep in mind that that not every place in the world has a persistent culture of that type. Uh, Another thing that I noticed in your posts, in both sections, I noticed a lot of talk of education, and I think that's good, but I'm not really going to touch on that. One thing I did notice that was brought up, James brought it up, and I think the most detailed way, but it was caught up by a number of other people as well, and that's the importance of that vocabulary. He said that when he was talking about bioregions and sustainability and all of these things in rural Arkansas, this maybe didn't go over so well. In West Virginia, I can tell you it's pretty much the same thing, and I'm in the most sophisticated part of West Virginia. But the the key is that that's a much larger point than just that, because in all kinds of negotiation with other people and even communications among individuals, the words that you use are critically important. And I thought you all might be interested in some farther abroad reading in this realm, things that greatly affected me 10 or 20 years ago when I first came across them, about the effect of vocabulary on our ability to communicate and to cooperate. And the first of those that I liked was a philosopher called Richard Rorty, Rorty. You don't need to write any of this down. I will post the links from my notes for this video with the links in there. But Richard Rorty was a philosopher and was at the University of Virginia and then Stanford, died recently, unfortunately. He talked about vocabulary from a political perspective, and if you go to my CB website, you'll see on the left side there's a thing on some of my academic papers, and one of them is called The Language of Technology, which talks about this issue and has links out to Rorty. The second, and probably more immediately pertinent to us, is a guy named George Lakoff, who wrote a book back in the 15, 20 years ago called Don't Think Like an Elephant, which is about how the political forces in the U.S. frame the arguments and really control how any kind of discourse happens. And that's critical to us when we're getting into a discourse about the food system, that we look for the subtle ways that some of the entrenched interests control the discourse about food by controlling the vocabulary. And I've got a link for you both to his book, Don't Think Like an Elephant, and to a YouTube lecture that he gave to the Commonwealth Club of California in, 2006. And the trends that he's identified in 2006, I mean, you look back at Dodge, who wrote 30 years ago and had identified a lot of these trends. Now you see George Lakoff back in 2006 pretty accurately predicting 2011, 2012. So he's very critical on a practical level. But if that interests you, the idea that there are hidden biases and meanings and directionalities almost in, and we'll talk about that. You'll get that in a later course, some more about directionality. But if you want to think about the real hidden content of words, Lakoff wrote another book with a cooperator called Mark Johnson, called The Metaphors We Live By. And what they do is they look at really basic words that you use every day and show how much additional information is actually in there and how much cultural loading and cultural expectation is built into the most basic of words that we use every day. So it's really fascinating. And another guy, Mark Turner, also, what these guys are cognitive scientists, also looks into how the really basic structure of metaphor and thought processes affects our ability to solve certain problems. And the linguists have talked about this for years, that certain languages, especially in non-industrialized areas, contain completely different concepts of time and space than we're used to. And that's really shows up almost in another way, because I was fascinated by the conversation about in the second half of the week, about nomadic and transitory types of relationships to the land. And it was interesting because the idea of the international agricultural consultants being intentionally transitory and perhaps doing some good, I don't really want to rule on that, as opposed to incidental transitory people like Bert Berry refers to, and how there is some difference between those two. And that made me think about, there's also two different kinds of nomadism that we were exposed to in these readings and discussions. One of them is the sort of Aboriginal North American nomadism, where there was a group or a sequence or a circuit of environments and places where the Aboriginal people would set up, and they tended to use the resources of that area, but not to the point where they wouldn't be there when they came back at the next season or whatever the structure of their nomadic cycle was. And that's the key, is it was a nomadic cycle. And the transitory nomadism that we often see criticized in terms of the patterns of the European immigrants is a linear nomadism more. It's the go west young man. They come to the East Coast, they wear that out, and then they proceed to the next spot down the line. And the whole sort of basic idea of linear progression as opposed to cyclical progression is one of the things that seems to characterize the difference between the post-Enlightenment industrial individualist way of looking at things and the pre-industrial cyclical, nature-based, biocentric view of things. And so it's really interesting to look at how you could have those four different kinds of transitory, nomadic relationships, and how some are good, some are bad, and perhaps some are indifferent to whether they're good or bad. But those are just a few of the sort of ideas I came up with in looking through your posts. I enjoyed them. I read every word. And I do want to say, on a practical note, keep in mind that you reference things that are not immediately apparent. I saw more of that in section 2 than section 1, that there were some references lacking. Also, when you're referencing things that come off websites, I would have to check the Chicago book myself, but I think that probably the author is the official name of the organization, not the website title, not the URL. So you might want to check that. When I get a moment, I will, and if I do find out that's the case, I'll start marking it up. It's not a serious thing, but we're trying to get through this program and come out being convincing in our arguments, and proper presentation is important to that. So we do want to get the references right, and you do want to check grammar as well as spelling, okay? Because there are a lot of, not as many as I've seen in some of the other classes, but there are a fair number of subtle grammar errors that can harm your credibility once you get out of the program and get out there trying to convince the people with your new vocabulary, your new style, and your new credibility.